Welcome, Ron. Thank you so much for being here today. I
Great to be
appreciate
here.
it very much. I am delighted that you have agreed to be one of our subjects for our video history. And we've had some conversations in the past that you and I can talk about right now.
Sure.
So thank you so much for being our guest on the Doylestown Historical Society video history. We have had a wonderful, long history of videotaping many people, and I believe you were part of some of that as well in the past, which you'll speak to. So most people will know you today as our guest, Ron Strouse, Mayor of Doylestown from 2014 to 2021. But you were also part of a large family that settled Doylestown. I'm going to just do a brief overview and then we'll speak to some of these points as we get through.
Sure.
You were truly a son of the Doylestown area. Your family lived in the area for several generations. Your mother's family settled in the area in the mid-1600s, I believe.
Right.
We'll speak a little bit to that. You're a graduate from Central Bucks High School District. You earned your Bachelor of Arts degree from the American University. You've resided in the Borough for over 2 decades. Your service to Doylestown has included your work as president of the boards at the County Theater, also a director with us right now in the Doylestown Historical Society, which we're very proud of. Director of the Bucks County Tourist Commission, Planned Parenthood of Bucks County, and you served as a chairman on the Doylestown Human Relations Commission. You also did work with the Doylestown Revitalization Board, and they're just some of the accomplishments that you've done along the way. In terms of your career, you worked as a corporate risk analyst for Pfizer. You were the youngest chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives, and you trained as a savory chef studying in Paris and in the U.S., also a student of world-renowned chef James Beard, which I'd love for us to talk a bit about. And you were a 20-year business owner of 2 boutique hotels and restaurants in Bucks County. So I'd like to speak a little bit about those areas.
Okay.
And I hope that you can start right now telling us a little bit about your ancestors that settled in the Bucks County area.
Well, my mother's family actually came from Massachusetts in 1688 to the Stockton area. And among those grandfathers, how many times removed, I think it's my 7th great-grandfather is actually a Rittenhouse, part of the well-known Philadelphia family of printers, and founder of the Mennonite Church in Pennsylvania in the United States. And then my mother's family eventually moved to Bucks County. My father's family came by ship to Philadelphia in 1738 and almost immediately moved here to Bucks County. And actually that family bore the name Strouse with a German spelling. And that family has resided here ever since. My great-great-grandfather had a farm in Gardenville. The house still remains. The old farmhouse still remains from the early 1800s. And it actually, one of the features of it, it has a beehive oven attached to it, which is relatively rare, but kind of distinctive. And then my grandfather, each generation, my father was the youngest of 12, 10 that survived. My grandfather was the youngest. So my grandfather was actually born, you can tell by the name, his name was Ulysses Grant Strouse, and so he was actually born in 1867. He had a general store and grist mill in Landisville, on Landisville Road. One of the things that happened during his lifetime is he moved his family into the grist mill to renovate the general store, which was also their home. And one of those children that did not survive actually drowned in the chase of the grist mill. So there's a long history there in terms of our family in this locality. My father was an excavator, and my uncles were masons, and they worked together, working on some of the more prominent, architectural features around the area because they were of their trades.
So they literally helped build the area?
They did. My father excavated for the current courthouse and courthouse and administration building, and there's a story about that. That would be in the late 50s. He turned his bulldozer over on top of him, and there's a picture on some front page of the Intelligencer. And the only thing that saved him is he had a cab on the bulldozer that kept it elevated. And then they worked on buildings like my father and uncle built what was then Doylestown Trust Company, which has gone through many different bank reiterations, and they were involved in restoration of Pearl Buck's house, but way back in the 1940s.
Were they?
Yeah, stuff like that.
So as you drive around, as you walk around, you can see all the work they did that actually helped build the town.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that, but some of that went on at a time when the town was going through a rough spot.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do want us to talk about that as well. Interestingly, you mentioned that that you were a graduate of Central Bucks. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Central Bucks was, there was no West in the name back then. I graduated in 1965. I think the school actually opened about close to 10 years before that. Amazingly, a very large graduating class of I think close to 400.
Wow.
All of us came together from elementary schools here and there. I went to Buckingham Elementary School, and then Lenape, which was open by then, and then Central Bucks. And there were a lot of members of the graduating class that either went somewhere else to go to college and then came back here, but a lot live in the community to this day. Yeah.
So I understand that when you graduated, it was a pivotal time not just for the country, but also in the town of Doylestown.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, probably until the pandemic, the most challenging time for Doylestown was in the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of businesses closed. When I was growing up, there was still the Ed's Diner and the Shive hardware store and the Weitzel drugstore and Leatherman Godshall, but there were changes going on. As we know, the nature of development back in the 50s was to create bypasses around communities like Doylestown, not just Doylestown, but communities all over. And then there was the growth of shopping centers and shopping malls and the popularity of those where people could drive and park and do a multitude of shopping tasks right in one location. So all that meant that communities like Doylestown were suffering. The solution that the government proposed was to provide funding for parking in the middle of your town. And that was made available to Doylestown, that there was a proposal to tear down a major part of the middle of the town that we know of from Court Street to State Street. And a lot of the buildings that we are so fond of and that we pride in would have been destroyed. Well, the town fathers, and they were all men at the time, but the town fathers came up with a proposal. It became known as Operation 64 to revitalize the town. Those fathers included a major business person, a banker, and an artist who came up with proposals as to what businesses could look like and financing to make them viable. That was the most important thing to save Doylestown and revitalize Doylestown. Coincidentally with that, the town government soon after that established a historic district to provide that kind of safety network for the preservation of our significant architecture. So that was pivotal in terms of moving Doylestown forward, and it frankly has remained the basis for revitalization to today. I mean, out of that came a borough committee, which was the revitalization board, which, as you mentioned, I chaired for a period of time before I became mayor, and there's a focus on that revitalization that continues today. Became very important more recently during the pandemic.
So this is all happening off in a small town as a reflection of what's happening through the country.
Exactly.
So we see this happening everywhere, but Doylestown had the foresight to be able to step in and organize this group. And this happened at a pivotal time in your life as well, because you were in high school at the time. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
And then you made probably some decisions based on some of the things that you were witnessing and living through. Was that?
I think it's fair to say, at least for me, that when I applied to undergraduate schools, I only applied to city schools. Mm-hmm. That was probably something subconscious that I felt I needed that kind of experience, and probably needed to get away for a while. I have to be very honest that I changed and Doylestown changed, and I think in both cases for the good. Yeah.
So you went to American University.
I did.
And you studied?
I studied political science.
Political science.
Washington, D.C., political science.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense.
Great. At a very important time, culturally and also politically changing in our country.
Yeah.
And these are all things that play into what you decide to do as you go on. And while you were at American University, tell us a little bit about the internship that you were able to secure.
I interned with our congressman from Bucks County, largely, he served largely just Bucks County, Pete Beester, Edward G. Beester Jr., but known as Pete. His father was a well-known judge at the time, and he served in Congress for 10 years. The internships back then were very focused, very organized, so that while you did work in the individual congressional office, you also participated in a number of programs with other interns. So when I was an intern, one of my colleagues, fellow interns, was David Eisenhower, the president's grandson. Another one was David Friedman, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize Economics Prize winner's son. And so we did a lot together. One of the things we did in a program funded by the Ford Foundation is I spent 2 weeks in Atlanta living in a condemned property that was selected for us for this purpose, and the women who were participating in the program lived in the property right next door. It was a little bit of a dichotomy because we were living in a condemned property, but we also had a cook. So, yeah. And we were given a function during the day, and my function was teaching swimming to African American children. And then in the evening we had meetings with political leaders of the entire spectrum. We had a meeting with Lester Maddox, who was the governor at the time. Very, very conservative politics. We had a meeting with the leader of SNCC in Athens, Georgia. We drove out to Athens, Georgia. And so we had a lot of experiences, interns, that probably were important in terms of our formative years. We also had a meeting in the White House. It was supposed to be a meeting with President Johnson, but he got wind that some of the interns were going to protest the war in Vietnam. Okay. So he handed that off to his staff.
And were you able to meet in the White House?
But we were to meet in the White House. So it was a very valuable experience, but also it was a time when there was lots of political activity in terms of in terms of my internship, obviously the war in Vietnam and civil rights movements and so forth. Yeah. And
that in turn led you to work as the chief of staff, is that correct?
Well, it led to that because, as you mentioned, I had worked in New York for a little over a year with Pfizer, which was a great sort of heady job for a young guy. I was a corporate risk analyst back then. These companies would have a lot of unaffiliated businesses. So Pfizer was, of course, at its core a pharmaceutical company, but they owned lots of other businesses unrelated, like Coty, cosmetics, and they owned a pigment business where they literally had a field in eastern Pennsylvania where they collected rust to make pigments. So that was a valuable experience, but I sort of wanted to go back to Washington, and I had written Pete Beester asking for his advice, not looking for a position, and he offered me this position as second legislative assistant. Usually congressional offices would have 2 legislative assistants. What happened was I joined that staff. The first legislative assistant went on to another position and then became a congressman from Virginia. So I was elevated to that. And the chief of staff retired within the year, and there I was. So it was very exciting at a very young age.
And you were the youngest chief of staff.
I was the youngest chief of staff.
So there was a lot happening, and you were there.
Yeah.
And you also spoke a little bit about a different atmosphere while you were living in Washington.
Well, the politics was very different. I worked for what was then known probably as a Rockefeller Republican. Pete Beester was a pretty moderate Republican for those 10 years. And they worked across the aisle. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. By and large, congressmen back then lived in Washington and then commuted back to their congressional district. Today, that's much less the case. Because they lived there, they were integrated to the social environment of other members of Congress. So they got to know each other, they got to respect each other, and they worked with each other more effectively than I think we would say they do today.
So it's a very different atmosphere.
It was
to
very
work in.
different, very different. Yeah.
So this is a very interesting point of view. Here you are working as the youngest chief of staff, and you eventually decide at some point that you are going to, in words we spoke about, have a repotting experience, which I think is so fascinating. So tell us a little bit about how your path changed a bit.
Pete Beester would remind me often. He was very much a mentor, and I highly respect him and that value to me. He would say that to grow, you need to get repotted every few years. And that, of course, gets really difficult as you get older. Yes. But that was part of my decision that I knew he was going to retire with a lot of advanced planning. He had only intended to be in Congress for 10 years, went on to be Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, and then a judge, of course. And so in that planning process as to what I was going to do after that job ended, of course I could have stayed in Washington, I guess, but I pretty much decided that I wanted to change course and become an innkeeper. Now, that was very romantic, but the real part of making an inn successful is probably to become a restaurant person, a restaurateur. And so I sort of planned that out to come back to Bucks County, but also to train to become a restaurateur and a chef. And that's where that started.
So a week after you leave.
A week after my job in Washington ends, I start school at the restaurant school in Philadelphia. And at the same time, we were negotiating to buy a property for our first restaurant in Upper Bucks County, in Haycock Township in Upper Bucks County. We did. We bought this. It was what's known as a shot and beer bar back then. But my partner Fred did the research on it at the Spruance Library and at the Bucks County Historical Society, and documented the 16 owners back to the early 1700s, mid 1700s really. And we picked the name that it was known by originally. 16 owners ago, which was the sign of the sorrel horse. As inns back then were known by the sign that they had. A lot of people couldn't read, and it was a sign that obviously had a sorrel horse on it, and so it was known as the sign of the Sorrel Horse Inn, which was the name we gave it going back to its history.
And that was your first endeavor?
That was the first endeavor. I met really talented people at the restaurant school who very young people who were willing to work with us when we got it started. And then right off, I did some additional training. I went to a chef school called Le Varan in Paris. And then a little bit later, I would drive to New York and cook with James Beard.
So you're trained as a savory chef, is that correct?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed the story you told me about working with James Beard and not knowing from day to day what your tasks would be, and it depended on what was delivered for the day. Yeah.
James Beard's home was right in the middle of Greenwich Village in New York. So you'd go in, and at that point, this was just only a couple years before he passed away. So he had been a well-known, perhaps famous chef for some time. So people and companies would have stuff delivered, whether it be a new appliance. Back then, the Cuisinart was the newest thing. So there were some changes in the technology in terms of producing food for restaurants. So sometimes it would be equipment like that, and sometimes it would be food. And they would hope, those who sent this to him, would hope that he might mention it, or he might not really endorse it, but say something positive about it. So when I would arrive, it would be no recipes, no indication of what we would do. It would be whatever appeared at the door or whatever he fancied that we would do. James Beard was a very robust guy. He obviously it was a commercial kitchen, but it was the first floor of his home that then spread out onto a patio. So he had a couple pugs, which were his favorite pets. A housekeeper, personal assistant who kind of, managed that aspect of his life. And he would kind of stand on a stool. He was very strong-willed. I mean, if you did something that was less than the way he thought it should be done, he absolutely and quickly made you know it.
Very good training.
Very good training. Yeah.
So all these are great experiences that you've had along the way. And then you say in your heart all along, you've really never left Doylestown. You returned, even when you worked in Washington. Yeah. This was part of the area that you worked in, you represented. And then you, of course, trained all over the world, in Paris and the US for your work as a chef. But your heart was here. Yeah. So interestingly, you felt that one of the most pivotal, important moves in the town in terms of cultural and economic growth was the use of expanding with the movie theater, where you would include dinner and a movie, and this helped expand the town in many directions. Can you speak to that a bit?
Well, the County Theater began as an institution called Closely Watched Films. Closely Watched Films would sponsor films at the James Laura House. And then over a period, and they would also have some outdoor films shown on the lawns of the Mercer Museum. Eventually, they also showed them in Carversville. There was a recognition that we thought we could do something more permanent, and the existing theater was closed, where the Strand was, where the county is now. And so we embarked on this very ambitious plan to have a lease purchase agreement on that property, and then did some major fundraising. I mean, This was a startup organization, so we had no idea whether there would be community support through fundraising to make this happen. As I recall it, our original fundraising, we changed the goal upward 3 times. The community embraced the idea of a county theater, a nonprofit county theater, with enthusiasm, nothing short of enthusiasm. As you mentioned, the county theater provided a change in the nature of hospitality in Doylestown. Most of the restaurants prior to the county theater were underwritten by the employees of the courthouse who would eat there during lunch. But in the evening, there was definitely a drop-off.
The town would close up.
Absolutely, absolutely. The county theater changed that. The county theater gave you a reason to come out to Doylestown in the evening, maybe do movies and a dinner, maybe do a little shopping, something like that. So the county theater was really the catalyst for that change, 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago.
So it's a very impactful move.
Exactly.
And you were happily surprised with the support that you received from truly a small community that stepped up and really enjoyed having this.
And I have to say, by the way, back then we had a retreat to do kind of a focus on what the future might look like for the county theater, like you always do. And sometimes those retreats turned into a bit of a pipe dream. And we would talk about this neighboring property called Poor Richards and say someday it would be really great to have that as an expansion of county theater. Little did we know it would take 20 years, but of course it happens now.
See, your retreat was very successful.
Yeah, there you go.
So we have this incredible turning point in the town, and then you have all of these tools that you've amassed during your career, and you decide that perhaps you'd like to run for mayor in this town.
Well, I don't think I decided whether I'd like to run for mayor. 10 years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, I was chairing the Academic Development Advisory Board.
Yes.
And then I also was chairing the newly established Human Relations Commission, which the borough had established through ordinance. I guess out of that, a couple members of Borough Council back then said, let's have coffee. And then that was really the catalyst for running for mayor. My opponent was a well-established businessman in Doylestown, Bruce Rutherford, who has passed. And of course it was a very civil, it's Doylestown, so it was a very civil campaign. I'd have to be honest and say that probably Bruce was expected to win, and I won by 78 votes.
Wow, 78 votes.
78 the first time. Second time, there was no opponent opposing me, but that's a little different story. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So this is the second time DHS has interviewed you. In 2018, you were a guest lecturer for one of our programs, the 1918 pandemic of flu, which was a little bit of a foreshadowing event of things that were to come. So it almost becomes a prophetic situation where here you are leading this town, and many years later you are immersed in a somewhat similar situation of flu. Right.
Yeah, little did we know. 2018, the 100th anniversary of the pandemic of 1918. And that, by the way, that talk really, the Doylestown Historical Society deserves all the credit for that. I mean, you did the research. I may have formulated it into a conversation, but the research was really done by the Historical Society. Because the talk was really focused on, yes, the international and the national history of the pandemic, but then how that pandemic translated in terms of what happened here in Doylestown
Right.
and the surrounding communities. Remember when you go to the Memorial Day Parade and you see that woman on a bicycle that's part of the VIA? That's Miss Muncie. Miss Muncie joined the visiting nurse program in October of 1917. She became an instant figure in our community, on her bicycle on the streets throughout town. She arranged a room at the local elementary school and introduced preventive health care, including dental examinations. She made, in October of 1918, during the height of the flu epidemic, 741 home visits in and around Doylestown. So of course what happened 2 years later is a couple organizations asked me to reprise that talk, but in conjunction with the pandemic that we were going through. And there was a lot to learn from that.
Yes.
There are comparisons that are valuable comparisons in terms of what happened in 1918 and then what happened over the last couple of years. The local Board of Health closed all hotels and wholesale liquor stores. The Doylestown Democrat reported that, quote, many who were out early in the morning for their eye-opener before breakfast were confronted by closed barroom doors with a sign that said, closed by order of the Board of Health. I said that Operation 64 was probably the most challenging environment for Doylestown in its history until the pandemic. For sure, the last few years have been a challenging environment for Doylestown as well. As best we know, we are still in the early stages of this critical fight for our lives and as well for our community. There has been overwhelmingly voluntary cooperation in practicing social distancing. Now is the time to intensify the ways and identify additional ways that we are falling short and make social distancing the norm rather than the exception. I personally think we've done better than most communities. There are a lot of reasons for that. We have a community that works well together. We have a health system that is exceedingly valuable to our community and very talented. So the kind of messaging in terms of what we could do health-wise to make our community safe came from very valuable sources. What is on everyone's mind is how is Doylestown Health doing, and how is your staff doing? Maybe you can share some insight in that.
Right. So Doylestown Health is doing exactly what it planned to do. We prepared for this moment.
There was a very deliberate kind of planning and execution of how we could keep our economy going during a pandemic. We closed streets on a frequent basis. We allowed businesses that had to run at significant reduced margins to then expand outside. We messaged how we would get through this. And there is a commitment, in terms of the borough, there is a commitment going forward to work with the community, the residents, and the businesses to make sure that the lasting effects of the pandemic are reduced as much as possible and that the vitality of town continues.
So of course there's no way of knowing any of this would happen. There's no plan. There's thoughts of emergency situations, but you were truly thrust into this very quickly.
I think that's for everyone. There was no game plan. There was no anticipation that this would ever happen. And so, yeah, there was no emergency preparedness in place. I think as a result of it, going forward, we're going to have all of that. And we've learned how to help vitalize businesses that going forward we'll use, because we want a community that has vitality. One of the things that took place, we have always treasured independent businesses, so that when you look around town, yes, there are chains, sometimes small chains, but by and large, most of our businesses are independent, independently owned. Well, during the pandemic, those businesses had no corporate structure behind them to back them up. So they were really
Struggling,
independent,
right.
struggling businesses that needed help, where we could find it. And going forward, we still want to have those independent businesses. And so that requires a little more hands-on to make the environment for them a good environment.
So it was quite an interesting way to finish out your tenure.
It was, and I sometimes thought, oh, am I running away from this? Because we thought we were through the pandemic a year ago,
Right,
and
right.
of course we're not. But I think there is a feeling now that maybe we can see that light. I think our community can be very proud of how they dealt with the pandemic by and large.
So that leads also bring up the status of Doylestown and the multiple awards that it won during your tenure.
Yeah.
And we're a town of what, 8,700?
Right.
A relatively small town.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I mean, you can't point to another community of our size that has the major cultural institutions that it does. I mean, that also requires that the 8,700 people who live here aren't a sufficient number of people to sustain those cultural institutions, for sure. And besides that, we are proud of the fact that we have all sorts of nonprofits. I was told, I've never been able to document this, that outside of Philadelphia, we have more nonprofits than anywhere in Pennsylvania. Now, they are all sorts of, they are sometimes nonprofits that help one individual, or they're nonprofits for a whole host of social services or cultural institutions. That's very much to be proud of, but it also requires responsibility to make sure that they are sustainable.
Yes.
And I think our community is committed to that.
It certainly shows
Yeah.
through the pandemic,
Yeah, I mean,
the commitment of the community.
and so those awards, like the best small town cultural scene in America, or one of the best 100 towns,
Far
small
and Wide
towns.
Travel magazine, one of the
Yeah.
best U.S. towns in November
Yeah.
21.
I mean, that is very
That's
exciting.
very impressive,
That's very
yes.
exciting. But it requires a commitment to make sure that we deserve it going forward.
Yes.
And that commitment's there.
Yes.
We're in good hands.
So we have a new Barrow Hall that is in place.
Yeah.
Everybody's very excited about it. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. I've been there a few times. It's phenomenal. And the park across the way looks as though it's going to be very promising. So tell me a little bit about how that evolved and developed.
Well, for me, it ticks all the boxes in terms of our commitment to environmental issues, historic commitment to historic issues. We took a brownfield and turned it into a park. I mean, that is about as good of a commitment to our environment as you could imagine. And then across the street, we took an industrial building, built in WPA era industrial building. We know that the most environmentally sensitive ways to engage in construction is to retrofit, to repurpose an existing building. And that's exactly what we did. We took an existing historic building and repurposed it for today's modern needs. So it has the environmental standards that you would expect in an old building that's transformed to new uses. It's outfitted so that in the future it can have solar panels on the roof. It's outfitted so that we can have a robust number of charging stations in the parking lot. And it fitted the modern needs of the borough and a police department. We had we have a police department that represents Doylestown, New Britain Borough, and Chalfont, an intermunicipal police department, Central Bucks Regional Police Department, and they were working out of about half of the square footage that was required to have accreditation. So we found a way to at a fair economic cost, to put them in a pretty close to state-of-the-art facility. So in my mind, it is win-win in every way. You know, arguably an eyesore in the middle of Doylestown has been turned into something very, very, very different. Yeah.
And how wonderful that you were part of that movement and part of that impact.
Well, it's been very exciting. And I mean, construction of that magnitude, the planning for it before that, I mean, is full of headaches. But at the end of the day, I think we did it right.
I believe so. Well, Ron, I thank you so much for your time today and your time in preparation for this.
It's been a delight.
And for your commitment to our organization, and of course for coming here today and speaking with me. So thank you so much.
Thank you very
Ron.
much.
Thank you.